This was a woman who I had read an article a few months ago about this incredible project where she effectively built an open source pancreas. And I was just reading this, and I'm like, wow, this is just fascinating. And how cool would it be if she would come speak to us at Revolution? And so I reached out to her on Twitter, of all things, and she was very gracious to come visit us in Las Vegas. And so without further ado, I'm really excited to bring to the stage fascinating project, fascinating woman, Dana Lewis, who's going to talk to us about her health project. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the warm welcome. I'm going to talk to you about We Are Not Waiting and the approach of using open source in healthcare. Now, a lot of people like binary jokes, but I use it to describe that there's two kinds of people in the room: those who do produce insulin and those who do not produce insulin. So I'm one of those people with type 1 diabetes, which is an autoimmune disease, which means my pancreas no longer produces insulin. Now, a lot of people are familiar with diabetes, so it sounds very easy. If you don't produce insulin, well, just inject it. It's that easy, right? Problem solved. But the reality is, even though we do have a drug to help treat diabetes, it's not perfect. The insulin that we take through injections or an insulin pump peaks in the body in about 60 to 90 minutes. So if I were to give myself insulin right now, it would take 2 talks worth of time for that insulin really to be active in my body. And the challenge with that is that food will hit the body in about 15 minutes. So there's so much more going on with a chronic disease than just your body doesn't produce this hormone or your body's not able to deal with something. And so it's really frustrating. And I tell people who haven't been diagnosed with a chronic disease that getting diagnosed with a chronic disease is like being hit by lightning. Your life changes so much. And the moment you're diagnosed, you're just trying to figure out how to survive. How do I deal today and tomorrow and the next day? But for many of us with chronic diseases, it's not just days or weeks or months, it's years. This October, I'll have been living with type 1 diabetes for 15 years. And I can say I'm doing very well, but it's still really hard because there's so many things that impact my blood sugar. There is the excitement and adrenaline of being on stage. That's going to send my blood sugar up. There's the fact that it's early, and I've got hormones surging from waking up before I'm normally used to, and that's going to change my blood sugar. And again, the insulin that I take for that takes longer to take effect than I would like to. And so some of the things that we measure, like food and insulin, that's great. But it's really hard to measure all these other things that are impacting your blood sugar. And that's what makes diabetes so hard. And that's what makes our blood sugars go up and down and up and down. And many times, we people with diabetes only have the tools to react. It's hard to really plan for your entire day or the next few days and figure out, how is everything that I'm going to do, from when I wake up and how much I exercise and whether I eat or not, and exactly what I eat and what I drink and how I engage with the world, that's going to impact my blood sugar. And so that's what makes it so very, very challenging. Now, it would be great to have some technology to help. And the analogy I like to use is driving a car, because most people understand that. And think about the difference between driving a car and trying to stay about the same speed at or below the speed limit or above, depending on how you drive. And imagine how much easier it is to have cruise control, where you can set it and say, I want to go 70 miles per hour on the interstate. And you can just set it, and the car will keep you at 70 miles per hour. And so you don't have to do as much work or keep your foot always on the gas pedal. That would be great. So in diabetes, the gas pedal that we have is insulin. So you can put your foot on the gas pedal and give yourself more or less, but it's much more effective to give yourself little bits and press on and give yourself a little bit more and back off versus slamming on the gas or completely taking your foot off. But that's what diabetes is like, because it's very hard, or there are trade-offs, and choosing to how you dose your insulin. You can give yourself a lot and not have to do much later, but you risk overdosing. You risk giving yourself too much, and the magnitude of error is a lot bigger when you make fewer decisions. So it would be great to have technology that would take away the need for me to have to manually do big decisions and big doses of insulin. And that's theoretically what the artificial pancreas is. It's technology that's essentially cruise control. So you can set your target blood sugar and say, I always want my blood sugar to be 100. Now, Would your blood sugar always stay there? No, but that's what it's going to target, and it does the work for you. It's an automated insulin delivery system. But the reality is, this technology has not existed. In 2014, I had been living with diabetes for over a decade, and I was very, very frustrated because even though I had the ability to get insulin, I had an insulin pump and a continuous glucose monitor, these tools are not perfect, and they're definitely not interoperable. When I met my husband on our first date, and I pulled out my insulin pump to kind of initiate a conversation about diabetes, he thought it was a pager. And on our second date, when I started telling him more about my continuous glucose monitor, which is a separate device, he said, oh, well, doesn't data from that device go to your pump? And I laughed at him because this is medical devices we're talking about. They're not interoperable. They make it very hard for patients to get data off at all, let alone in real time, let alone using that data for dosing decisions. So that was not the reality here in 2013 and 2014 when we were first dating and he was really getting to know diabetes. And so there's a lot of frustrations. Even with all the tools at the time, they still weren't good enough. Now, I go see an endocrinologist regularly, as most people with diabetes do. And at one point in time, about this same time in 2013, my doctor asked me to bring some of my data in. Well, who here runs on a Mac? Okay, a lot of people. And who here runs on a PC? Okay, about half and half. So congratulations, because if you were a PC user, you could get retrospective data off the medical device if you had it. For all of us Mac users, you're out of luck, because the FDA-approved software version was only for PC. So I had no way to get my data off my device and share it with my doctor. I was really frustrated. So my workaround was to use the technology that I had. So every day I would pull my phone out of my pocket, take a picture of the receiver, copy and paste that into Excel, and I printed it out and handed it to my doctor. And that is a very common story when you're talking about how patients get their own data and how they use it. It's really frustrating. And the other reason I like to share this particular set of graphs, in addition to the struggle to get my own data, is showing you that even when I was trying to do everything right and working incredibly hard, even with all the tools possible at the time, you can see how much I went up and down and up and down and red and yellow. And what that time in the red and the yellow means is time when I felt bad, or time when I had to stop working, or I couldn't run, or I couldn't spend time with my family and friends. It takes away from everything else that I do, in addition to making me feel bad. So that's not ideal, and by most medical standards, I was doing the best that most people could do, and it's still not anywhere perfect. Now, the other frustration with these devices is that you can't change them. So despite not being able to produce insulin, my body is flawed, but I have this one superpower that most people don't. I am the world's best sleeper. I will sleep as long as I possibly can, 12 hours, 14 hours. Now, that's amazing, except for the fact that I have diabetes, and my blood sugar doesn't stop changing and moving when I'm asleep. And so my continuous glucose monitor, this device pictured, is supposed to wake me up if my blood sugar begins to drop dangerously low or goes too high. And that's what those red and yellow lines are the lines at which it will alert and say, hey, wake up, pay attention. Now, because I'm such a good sleeper, I sleep through these alarms. So when I moved to Seattle after college and lived by myself, I was afraid because I would wake up in the morning and cringe and kind of have, just reach over and press the device and see how many hours was I terribly low, how much was my life at risk. And I actually feared going to sleep every night. And that's a terrible, terrible way to live, to be afraid to go to sleep because you're afraid you're going to die in your sleep. And that's a real risk with diabetes, because even if you had a picture-perfect flat blood sugar day, because there's things like exercise, which can impact your body up to 36 hours later, you can do everything right. Your blood sugar can drop dangerously low the next night. And unless you wake up and take care of it, you're at risk of going very, very low and into a coma. And that's very, very, very scary. Now, I would reach out to the medical device manufacturers and say, I have a problem. Your device doesn't work. Can we change the alarms? Can we make bigger alarms? Can we do something? And I got back a variety of answers from multiple manufacturers. I was told it's loud enough for most people, which was not my favorite answer. I got, it's a trade-off in battery life. I got, we're working on it, it'll be out in a couple years. And what people don't understand is every night, That's a few years is a lifetime away and living with diabetes, it feels like, because that's 365 times 2 or 3 years. That's a lot of fear that you have to live with, and it's not just me. I mentioned I moved to Seattle. My family was in Alabama. My backup system to not hearing my alarms was to ask my mom to text me every morning to make sure I was awake, which was code for making sure that I was okay and up and everything. And that's not fair for my mom to have to worry about checking in on her grown adult daughter, but that was the only way we could think of at the time because we couldn't do anything to change the devices, or so we thought. Now, I've mentioned how hard it was to get my data off. I couldn't, but I thought, if only I could get my data off, not just retrospectively, but in real time. I have this great idea for sending my data to the cloud and down to my phone and making a louder alarm, because I can change the sound and the type of alarm and the volume on my phone. That would be really, really great. But again, couldn't get my data off my device to give to my doctor. How was I going to get it into real time? And so this was my first introduction to open source through social media. Will mentioned that he thought it was kind of weird that he reached out to me via Twitter. That's actually very normal because I spend a lot of time there. And Twitter has done so much for me, including showing me a picture from a gentleman named John Kasich in New York who has a son with type 1 diabetes. And John had posted a picture saying, my son's at preschool. I've got his continuous glucose monitor receiver plugged into the computer, uploading data to the cloud so I can see it while I'm at work. And I thought, this is brilliant. If only he would share his code with me, I could build my louder alarm system. Wouldn't that be great? And I knew nothing about open source, and I didn't think he would say yes, but I figured worst thing he'll say is, no, I won't share my code. So we actually reached out to him. He said yes. He shared his code with us, and my life has been changed ever since because I was able to use his code and write a script to get the data in real time, stick it in Dropbox, upload it to the cloud, down to my phone, and to make a louder alarm. And that louder alarm really works. So I went from sleeping through the night to waking up on the alarm. But I knew there was still this slight chance that I might sleep through one of those really loud alarms if I was really low and in a really deep sleep. So I wanted to enable my family and my loved ones to be able to see the data. So we put snooze buttons into the system so that if I did wake up and take action, I would snooze the system and it wouldn't alert anybody else. But if I missed a couple of alarms in a series of time, and depending on what my blood sugar was, it would then cascade and alert the rest of my network, which was great. Now, because I started being a really well-trained guinea pig, self-trained guinea pig, and anytime I did something, I would press the button to say, I'm awake, I've got it, don't worry about it. Well, we also put in buttons to have me tell the system what I was doing, so that if somebody did check the system and I was low, they didn't worry about me doing the wrong thing. So I would tell it, I'm drinking a juice box. I'm giving myself insulin. Here's what my blood sugar is. And we were able to use that data to not only respond in real time to what the blood sugars were, but to build an algorithm to predict into the future. And this is significant because all the tools at the time were point of time, here's what you are. And you had to use your own mind and your own knowledge of the data to kind of mentally draw a graph of how long am I going to be low? How far am I going to go low? Am I eventually going to go high? And what do I do? And so we built this system that allowed us to be predictive about what would happen and give me proactive alerts and alarms that said, hey, you're okay right now, but you're going to go low in an hour and a half. So if you do something now, if you reduce your insulin now, you can completely prevent or lessen the severity of that low. And this essentially was just what I thought was the best thing since sliced bread. It woke me up, it did the math for me, it told me when to pay attention. This was huge, but I was still the human in the loop. And so this was an open loop system, although we didn't know it at the time. I just thought it was so cool. I called it the do-it-yourself pancreas system, or DIYPS. Totally joking, because again, this was all about waking me up at night. But now, I have to tell you, there's not just 2 kinds of people in the room. There's 3 kinds of the people in the room. There's those who have a DIY closed-loop artificial pancreas, those who produce insulin, and those who do not. And I'm one of those people with a DIY artificial pancreas. Because what we found over the course of a year after using that smart alarm system, and by talking about it in social media and working with others in the open source community, there was somebody named Ben West who had spent years figuring out how to communicate with my other medical device, the insulin pump. And so if you take my insulin pump and my continuous glucose monitor, and you add in a small computer, like a Raspberry Pi, and a radio stick and a battery, you end up with a do-it-yourself artificial pancreas. And this technology, I thought before was life-changing. This is amazing, because instead of waking me up at night because my blood sugar was going to go low or was low or high, this would say your blood sugar is dropping. We're going to reduce insulin and completely prevent the low. Your blood sugar is rising. We're going to give you more insulin and make sure you stay in range all night long. So the graphs you see at the top, those beautiful flatline graphs, that's 10 and 12 hours of uninterrupted sleep where my body was feeling amazing because my fake DIY artificial pancreas was doing all the hard work. And if you look at the graph on the right, that's actually another open source tool called Night Scout, where I can visualize not only my blood sugars, but also what the pancreas is doing. So you can see the blue lines going up and down. That's the level of insulin delivery. And so as my blood sugar drops, you can see the blue lines drop down below that dotted line. And occasionally, when I had a compression low and I needed to give myself a little more insulin for 5 minutes or later on into the morning, it was able to give me more insulin. And so I was able to sleep the night. I still am able to sleep through the entire night while the system regulates my blood sugar for me. And I mentioned Raspberry Pi. There have been people in the community who have also created other hardware versions that can work well with the system. And so my pancreas now is this. It's the size of 2 chapstick. It's really tiny, and you may not, depending on where you're sitting in the room, have noticed it. And that's awesome for me to be able to have a discrete device that basically offloads my diabetes brain into the computer. Because think about it, computers don't go to sleep, they don't get lazy, so it's going to run every 5 minutes, and they don't round. We humans are lazy, so we're going to round up and down or say, oh, no, I don't need to do anything right now. The computer says, you need 0.05 units of insulin, I'm going to give you the 0.05 units of insulin. So it's able to make those small adjustments up and down depending on how much insulin you need. Now, I mentioned a community, and I mentioned how much this technology is life-saving. I would not have been able to create my own system had it not been for many other people in the open source community helping out with various pieces of the project. But I also knew that I could not keep this technology to myself. And so we had a couple of options. One of the first questions people ask me is like, well, why didn't you patent it and create a company? Well, maybe this room wouldn't ask that since you're open source advocates. But the answer was, we didn't want to become a medical device company. And if we did become a company, we would be regulated by the FDA, and I couldn't share with anybody else. And as a person with diabetes, I was not okay with that. So we decided to go the open source route. And that's why we created the OpenAPS movement, which stands for the Open Source Artificial Pancreas. And this was, I created my system in December of 2014, and we did OpenAPS kind of as a launch of a project in February of 2015. And I thought, you know, if 1 to 2 other people end up building themselves a pancreas and using it until something commercial is available, that'd be great, and it'd be worth the time we did to open source it. But there are now lots more people who are doing this, and they're not traditional programmers. They're not traditional developers and engineers and scientists. It's people all over the world, not all speaking English as their first language, not technical, because what this system does is it has the computer do what the person would do. It says, read the data from the pump, read the data from your glucose, predict what's going to happen, and take action every 5 minutes in small adjustments. This system is totally designed around safety, because who cares more about safety than I do? No one. So we designed the system so when somebody first turns it on, it does the most safe, basic thing, which is to reduce insulin. And only after somebody understands the system can they go in and adjust the safety settings to allow the system to give more insulin. And there's dosing limitations both on the hardware, on the insulin pump, as well as the software. And we've designed to work with bad data where the sensor is jumping up and down. We've designed it to work and to deal with a scenario when your CGM sensor dies and you get no data, or you walk away from the system. And so what we've done is use what we call a temporary basal rate, which is a 30-minute dosing command that basically overwrites what that underlying insulin level should be. So for example, right now, if my insulin level was 1.3 units per hour, and the system would look down and see, your blood sugar's a little high because you're excited right now. You need more insulin. So it might send a command that says, give 1.45 units for the next 30 minutes. And the idea being, we assume that the last command it sends is going to be the last thing that ever succeeds. So we do something conservative and send it and say, this is the last command, it's the safest thing to do based on the available data and based on everything that we know about your settings. And if I walk away from it, the battery dies, somebody comes up, grabs it, and runs away, that 1.45 units will run for the next 30 minutes and then fall back to normal pump operations. So our worst off scenario is just being like everyone else with a dumb pump that doesn't respond to blood sugar. And like many open source projects, you can check out the code online. It's on GitHub. But one important thing to me is that the documentation as well is on GitHub and is open source. And we've had hundreds of people commit to the documentation. And the reason I love that is because, number one, without documentation, people don't know how to build it, how to succeed with it, and they're not able to share knowledge as effectively on other forums like Facebook or Gitter, because it's really hard to search those forums over time. The other reason is, for many people like me, who are not traditional engineers and programmers, who have no knowledge of open source, had never touched GitHub before, being able to put your name on a list in a document or fix a typo in GitHub is a great way to get comfortable with the process of pull request and collaborating with others online when you can't see them. And it's a great way to work into actually editing the code and doing pull requests on the code side. So that's one of the reasons I am really proud that we chose very early on to do open source documentation as well, because it makes the documentation better, but it also allows the community to get familiar with the different processes. And one of the other common questions I get is about, well, what about regulation? Who's regulating this activity? And the answer is that users are. It's not regulated by the FDA because it's not distributed. Therefore, there's no company, there's no distribution, therefore it's not regulated by the FDA. But when people don't have diabetes, they think that people are just blindly accepting technology, and that's not the case. When a person with diabetes gets a new tool, whether it's a new insulin pump or they're investigating an open source artificial pancreas, they don't just slap it on and say, okay, everything's gonna be great. You know that you have to really poke at the technology and test it and understand what it can and can't do. And with open source, people are even more thorough. And that's the beauty of open source, is the code is fully available for people to read before they even think about getting started with the project. They can share it with their friends and family. They can ask questions of people who've built various features and of community members who have been using it. That's so, so incredibly important. And then the other thing to remember on the regulation topic is that individuals with health conditions can do whatever they want. It's called self-experimentation. If you talk with your doctor about it, they just have to say, you know that's an off-label use of your FDA-approved medical device. And you say, yeah. And they say, OK, box checked, moving on. So people can do whatever they want. And that's why we really emphasize the DIY aspect of this project, but also the N of 1 times many aspect, because it truly is N of 1 times a lot. There are now over 400 people worldwide in the past 2.5 years who have built various types of these DIY closed-loop systems. And that's very significant because collectively as a community, and this is an underestimate, we have more than 2 million patient hours of experience with this technology. That's a lot of learning. We know what happens when you take it off and go scuba diving. We know what happens when you fly. We know what happens when you take your technology through airport security. You name a situation, and we've had people do it. And that's incredibly important because we want to share that back with the broader diabetes community, but also the traditional manufacturers. They are working on commercial versions of these solutions. It's just taking seemingly forever for them to come out. There's one that's finally approved in the US, but it's not approved anywhere else in the US or in the world. And there's also not the supply to meet the demand of people who want this technology. There's also questions about access, insurance coverage, and affordability. But the first system that's coming out, if you know anything about the development of medical devices and how long it takes, this thing was designed years ago before we even started closing the loop for myself. And so the algorithm, the design, the usability, that was all baked in years ago. And so this commercial system doesn't have any of the learning and the knowledge that we've learned from the DIY community. And so what we're trying to hope to do is to share back with the broader community and these companies by telling them what works and what doesn't and what they need to change. Some companies are listening, others are not. But there was actually news released earlier this week. There's a Korean pump company called Suil, and they make a very confusingly named product called the Dana R insulin pump. It has nothing to do with me, but they have this insulin pump named Dana, and one of their pumps has Bluetooth in it. So there are people who took our algorithm, because it's open source, and instead of requiring a physical rig, you don't need that if the pump talks Bluetooth to an Android phone. And so they're able to run our code on an Android phone and allow the pump to talk directly to it for people to close the loop without having to have the physical pancreas rig. And what's amazing is that the company, when they heard about it, they reached out to the key developer who lives in the Czech Republic and with us and wanted to learn more and figure out how they could design their next product, which is what was announced, the Dana RS, still confusingly named, they won't change it for me, to figure out how to make it even better for the DIY self-driven community to interface with. And they are totally supportive of what we're doing because they see it as a huge business advantage. They're the first pump company to work with the open source community, and we've been able to help them make their product better. And people are clamoring all over the world for it and waiting for it to get approved in their market. And that's really why open source is changing the way we think about innovation and the way we think about the future of healthcare. Now, I mentioned those 2 million patient hours. Well, traditionally, because it's an N-of-1 DIY project, people self-host their data. And starting about last fall, I was getting an email about once a week from a researcher, various kinds of researchers saying, hey, you mentioned all this data. Well, I know that it's self-collected, but can I just get yours? You talk about diabetes a lot. Won't you share your data with me? And I felt kind of iffy on that because I don't represent everybody with diabetes. My data does not represent everybody with diabetes. But I also wasn't comfortable with my personal data with my name on it being the one thing that people started researching. And I was also really frustrated about the reasons why they were reaching out to me. They were trying to circumvent IRB and saying, well, the IRB won't let me use X and Y and Z, so I just want to grab yours and kind of do a quick study and do feasibility and figure out if we can do it. And I thought, this isn't really ideal, and I can't support all these researchers, but I do want to get more research going, and I want to get the community's data to a place where patients can study it, traditional researchers can study it, and the companies can use it to make better products. And so we created what's called the OpenAPS Data Commons on the Open Humans platform. And I recommend you check out Open Humans if you're not familiar with it. It's a very cool platform that allows individuals to upload various types of data, and you get to set the controls on who sees your data. So you can share it with this project, but not that one. You change your mind, and you can pull your data out of that project. And so I actually helped build an uploader to get Night Scout data into Open Humans, which is, Night Scout is what I use to visualize my data, so that's where it's stored. And it anonymizes the data and uploads it and enables people to donate it into the shared pool of data. And we did this earlier this year, and so we now have a couple dozen data sets, which is pretty good. And we're going to be able to have not only the traditional researchers use it, so when I get those queries saying, I want to do a study, I have an easy way to share batches of data, but also the patient community has tons of ideas, not just around device development, but ideas around insulin dosing and timing and how to be as efficient and effective as possible with the limited tools that we have. And so that's why we've created that, and I'm really, really excited about that because I think it's going to make a huge difference. But that's not all. I think we can do so much more in healthcare. And that's what I really want to challenge you to think about. Because maybe you have somebody in your life with diabetes. Great, and you might be excited by this project. But there are so many other health conditions out there. There are people with cystic fibrosis, with asthma, with cancer, with all kinds of health conditions. And people think diabetes and the diabetes community is uniquely suited to this idea of we are not waiting and DIY, because diabetes is a very data-driven disease, and that's true. But so many of these other health conditions, they have devices, or they have data, whether it's symptom tracking or treatment managing, but people just haven't put their minds towards using data or using technology for those healthcare conditions. And I really want to challenge you to think, what would be possible if you take your knowledge and enthusiasm for open source and turned around and figured out how you could partner with somebody you know, or whether it's a professional colleague or somebody in your life, and applied that methodology, but don't try to throw a solution at them. Because people living with health conditions deeply understand what is the biggest pain point. What is the sandpaper friction, where if you took that away, if you solve for this tiny thing that you think doesn't matter from the outside, would make a huge difference in the quality of life. And that's one of my favorite parts about OpenAPS, is there are a lot of people developing. Some are adults with diabetes. Some are partners and spouses of people with diabetes. My now husband and I do a lot of paired programming because he'll have an idea, and we'll talk through it, and I'll say, well, that doesn't exactly work because of this use case and that use case, but if you pivot that and do something else, that would be really effective. And you also have to think about all different kinds of use cases. So what works for me as an adult doesn't necessarily work for a kid. Because we have to make sure that parents of kids are part of the design and the development and the coding process too, and they're part of the testing process to make sure that what we're putting out there as a community is going to work for everybody. And that's the reality with OpenAPS, is we have people as young as 1 and 2 years old, and people into their 70s using this technology. And it's the same algorithm. It doesn't matter if you're this big or this big. It's able to read in your personal settings and use that to tune the algorithm to do what it needs to do. And that's what's incredibly valuable, is working together like that to design something that's flexible and customizable. Because there's nothing worse than having to carry a medical device or 2 medical devices, and then being told that you have to change your phone in order to use like the Dream app or the Dream solution. With OpenAPS, people kind of come as they are with whatever CGM they want and whatever phone they want. So you can build this on Linux and use an iPhone, or you can build it on a PC and use your Android. You can basically use whatever technology you have, and that's so nice not to have to change yet another thing in order to leverage this technology. But I think there really is endless opportunities to use open source to change healthcare, and I want to encourage you to be that kind of person. The person who says, yes, I'm going to use open source in a different way than I've used it before. Because the traditional way of doing things is to think about the solution. So if you traditionally worked for a company and you wanted to come up with a solution, you would say, okay, we've got to create a car because people need a car. Well, most people, most companies would say, well, our timeline is 5 years to have the car, so we can't put anything out before then. Because would you sell or put out the body of the car, the wheels and everything? No. And that's the way a lot of healthcare design is done, is, hey, in 5 years, you can have this really great thing. Forget all the changes and the updates and everything else we've learned in that 5-year period. Our design from 5 years ago is what we're going to come out with a perfectly done car with in 5 years. But what we patients do is really deeply understand the actual problem we're solving for. The car is a solution, but the problem is, how do we get from point A to B as quickly as possible? And if at the end of the day it has air conditioning, great, but we will skateboard down the Las Vegas Strip if we need to, because that's the fastest way to get there and it's better than walking. And so that's what we do. We start with the simplest solution possible, which might be that skateboard, and move into a scooter, and a bike, and a motorbike, and eventually a car. And the car that we end up with is probably better than the person who designed theirs 5 years ago, did not collaborate throughout that time period, did not test and iterate and get feedback. And think about the users. The people who had to wait 5 years with nothing, they're really unhappy and they may not want to wait anymore. And that's the reality in healthcare, at least in diabetes, is now people have options where they don't have to wait for a commercial system. You can choose to wait, but it's so exciting to have that choice back and to have the power in our hands to say, I want to use this technology this way because it's the best thing for me. And if in a couple weeks or months something comes out that's better, a different DIY system that I like better, or this different feature, or there's a commercial system that I want to go onto, great. You're able to do that, but you have the choice, and that puts the power back in the person's hands. But remember that cruise control analogy. We've got cruise control. We've got actually a self-driving car. So we still have to be in the car, taking care of our diabetes and awake and alert on the road, but we don't always have to have our hands on the wheel and the foot on the pedal and paying so close attention in order to get the outcomes that we want. And so that's what I want to challenge you to think about, is we patients are not waiting to change healthcare, and I don't want you to wait either. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.